Now, without further ado, I want to jump right into our conversation this morning with our Attorney General here in Washington State, Bob Ferguson. He's, of course, had a lot of roles and a long public career, or rather long career in public service, and is now really one of the most, I think, influential, most activist, one of the attorney generals who's really pushing amongst all 50 attorneys general for reforms in not just healthcare, but in a lot of areas of consumer protection, market competition, and otherwise. So we're very honored to have you, Mr. Attorney General. Thanks for making time.
DJ, great to see you, and thanks for doing this. Hope everybody's staying healthy. And I one thing I learned already this morning is I've got to start more of my days with a Yeats poem. So I'm gonna go to work on that. So thanks for reading that.
It's a goal many of us should aspire to.
That's right.
So give us a rundown first. Just how are you spending your time these days? The work of government doesn't stop, even if many people are working from home. Tell us what you've been up to the last year or two with your office.
Sure. So first, I wish I was in Spokane with you in person, obviously, and everybody else, rather than the basement of my home in North Seattle. But our office, the AG's office, which, by the way, has 13 offices all around the state, including one in Spokane, for example. So for us, we are primarily still working remotely. Obviously, with courts having opened back up, we need to have a certain number of people in our offices when there's a trial going on, for example. But I've probably been in the office less than 10 times since the pandemic hit. I primarily work from home like everybody else. So I guess the way I would summarize that question, DJ, is, we have the work of our office, which is, of course, representing every state board, commission, and agency, of which there's hundreds, a couple hundred, right? And the governor and the statewide elected officials and legislature, in addition to all that affirmative work we do, which we'll probably be talking about in a little bit on behalf of the people. We've got all of that work. On top of that, we have work related to the pandemic. And as you might imagine, if you're the law firm representing the Department of Corrections, the Department of Corrections has some legal issues going on with COVID, right? As does literally every part of state government. So as the law firm for state government, as you can imagine, we have our normal workload, plus all the issues that are often tricky related to the pandemic, the governor's emergency proclamations, and doing that remotely. But I'm really proud of the team. They've been doing great work during a challenging time. And I think we're all looking forward to getting back in the office, but frankly, doing that only when it's safe for everybody in the office.
I want to make sure our attendees know that you can, of course, put in your questions there in the chat box on the right of the screen. And, one of the things we've learned about this virtual space is that questions beget questions. And when you post questions, other people will post questions, or you can upvote those questions so that we make sure that we can prioritize those. And as our conversation moves forward, I'll make sure that I try to integrate many of those into our conversation with the Attorney General. Let me ask you first, sir, rather than getting into the weeds on law or policy, leading your office, you got a lot of folks in your agency. How have you found the challenges of being a CEO of the organization in terms of supporting mental health, supporting the physical health of your folks, supporting culture, in terms of the leadership of the office? How has that been from where you sit?
That's an interesting question, DJ. So I'm now in my 9th year as Attorney General. So I've been at it for a little while. Folks may not know our office has more than 1,000 employees. So we have about 650 attorneys, similar size support staff. And I mentioned 13 offices all around the state. So we're the largest law firm in the state of Washington. And so in terms of the office itself, what I would say is I was fortunate and really blessed to come into the office, an office that has a really wonderful culture. My predecessors, both Republican and Democratic, have really had a reputation of running a nonpartisan law office. And that's our job, is to do that. That doesn't mean I don't make decisions, or my predecessors didn't make decisions that can outrage people or make people angry or make people really excited. But just to give the folks watching a sense of this, when I became Attorney General, the chief deputy, the deputies, the closest advisors to the Attorney General, the folks that were all in place under my predecessor, Rob McKenna. Rob and I are different political parties. I kept all those people, every division chief for every division we have, consumer protection, you name it. All those folks stayed on to serve under me in that exact same role. And Rob McKenna, when he followed Chris Gregoire, they're different political parties as AG, he kept all of her leadership. So that's really the tradition in our office, which is not typical necessarily amongst AG offices around the country. And so one thing I just want to emphasize is, in some respects, I want to say it's easy. We're running a large law firm. It's complex. There are obviously challenges, but I feel really fortunate. And I think, frankly, the people of the state of Washington should feel fortunate that the folks who run our office and the day-to-day attorneys and professional staff. These are professionals. They're not political appointees. They've been at this for a long, long time. They'll be at it after I'm gone as Attorney General. And that's the way it should be. We run a professional, nonpartisan office. There are challenges, of course, especially during the pandemic, to try and keep that culture when we're all working remotely. But I suspect everybody who's on the Zoom call can relate to that in their own workplace. We're no different in that regard.
One of the big topics in health policy when it comes to attorneys general in recent weeks has been the settlement or resolution of opioid cases, or at least one case among the three or handful that are still very active. First, give us a sense of where opioid legislation is, and on the Purdue case, why your office decided. I think there are only about 7 or 8 AGs that decided to appeal the settlement, including the U.S. Department of Justice. Give us a sense of why you didn't think that settlement made sense for the people of Washington.
Sure. So I'll try and give a relatively short answer, DJ, but feel free to do follow-ups, or folks can ask follow-ups as well. It's a huge subject, as you might imagine, litigation around the opioids epidemic that state AGs have been very, very involved in, and local governments and tribes as well. So first, just taking a half step back, the epidemic, I think folks who are on this call understand how terrible and awful it's been for our state, our communities, for families, and for individuals. But just to put one statistic in front of everybody, on average in Washington state, 2 people die of an opioid overdose every day. That's not having an overdose, that's people who die because of an overdose. And just look around our communities and we see the impacts of the epidemic. So Washington state, we filed lawsuits against a large number of entities. These are entities that we think were most responsible for fueling the opioid epidemic by acting illegally. So we have multiple cases going on. The one that you mentioned in particular, which is in the news literally right now, is litigation against Purdue Pharmaceutical, who created OxyContin, and the Sackler family, which owns Purdue Pharmaceutical and is active in making decisions with Purdue Pharmaceutical. And I think, as folks probably know, what's been in the news a lot lately is Purdue filed for bankruptcy. So there's a bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York, and the Sackler family is not going through bankruptcy. But what they've done is essentially grafted onto the bankruptcy proceedings. And what's in front of this bankruptcy judge, what the judges decided was, the judge granted a plan approved by most of the AGs, about 41 AGs, by the way, that allows for Purdue to go through bankruptcy. The Sacklers pay a few $1 billion into that bankruptcy fund to be distributed around the states. But a key thing here, DJ, is that the judge is allowing the Sackler family, who again is not going through bankruptcy. They've got billions and billions and billions of dollars, okay? What they're allowed to do is they are granted a legal shield for life from any civil litigation brought by any individual who is harmed by their unlawful conduct, or even a state attorney general from bringing a lawsuit against them. And that is breathtaking, that a bankruptcy judge in New York can impose that on the state of Washington. So you're right, we're appealing that. But in my view, any deal that allows the Sackler families, and by the way, they don't deny this, to be wealthier when they're done making payments, number one. Number two, that grants them a legal shield for life. And number three, lets them walk away without so much as an apology or acknowledgement of what they did. To me, that's not justice. Just because you're a billionaire, you don't get to buy your own form of justice and get a legal shield for life. That's not the way it works. You're accountable in the court of law just like everybody else is. But the judge has approved this. So right now, Connecticut, which is where Purdue's based, Washington, we filed our notice of appeal along with the District of Columbia. I do anticipate some other states will join us in that appeal, along with the Department of Justice, to your point. Happy to chat about what that appeal looks like, how long that might go. I don't take that decision lightly, but I just felt strongly that it was not enough money. A different form of justice for the Sacklers, that's not right. A legal shield for life that the judge doesn't have the power to impose, and not so much as an apology for the harm they did. All those things combined led me to the decision to appeal the bankruptcy judge's decision.
How would you characterize, I know this is tough and you'll be diplomatic as is always the case, but how would you characterize the other 40 plus AGs that signed on to this settlement? Do they just think it's enough money? Do they, I know there's a diversity, both Democratic and Republican AGs. Are they just tired of dealing with this? Are they just wanting to put this issue to bed? I know if you got 41 AGs, there's probably 42 opinions on that, and it's hard to characterize. But how would you try to explain to us why they think one way and which enlightens us about how it is that why you're thinking a different way.
I think what I would say is, for sure, I like that line. There's 41 AGs and 42 different opinions. It probably sums it up right, but I may borrow that sometime. But what I would say is there are probably a couple key reasons that I'm hearing from my colleagues and that they're sharing publicly, by the way. So number one thing that's important to keep in mind is not every state is litigating against Purdue or the Sacklers. So we have been very active. In fact, we are on the verge of going to trial against Purdue Pharmaceutical when they file for bankruptcy. So we are in a very different position than a state that never filed a lawsuit or filed a lawsuit, but they're not really litigating it, right? In other words, we felt we were in a position to get more from a trial, more dollars, more accountability, more justice for Washingtonians than most other states. So for an AG who hasn't even filed a lawsuit, hey, if you're handed a certain amount of money for your state and you've not had to do anything litigation-wise, hey, that may be an appealing deal. Less so for us. Number two, I do think some AGs feel it is sufficient money. Number three, I think they feel that a protracted litigation can take a long time to get the result you want, which I think is a fair observation. I think another thing is that some state AGs simply don't have the resources to bring a case to trial this magnitude. We're going to trial literally in November against 3 Fortune 15 companies, distributors of opioids, think Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen. That's because we have the resources in Washington State to file a lawsuit, go through all the extensive litigation that you have to actually have a trial. Most states don't even have the resources to do that, DJ. If they wanted to, they couldn't. So not all 50 state AGs are in the same position, so to speak. And maybe the last thing I would just say is that, for me, when we filed our lawsuits against Purdue, when we filed them against these Fortune 15 companies, that's a separate litigation. What I told the team when we made that decision years ago was we're going to litigate these cases. We're not just going to file and sit down and wait for a settlement. We're going to litigate those cases, which has put me in a stronger position on behalf of the people to say, hey, no, we want to take these cases to trial because one, there should be accountability, and two, we think we'll get a better outcome. But not every state AG is in that same position. So, I suppose at the risk of going on a bit too long, I should also add, look, the Sacklers and Purdue Pharmaceutical have, to say they have all the resources conceivable to hire the best lawyers to make life as difficult as possible to hold them accountable would be a dramatic understatement. And so if you want to take them on, you better be ready for a lengthy fight. And we are in Washington State, but not every AG is positioned that way. It's an investment of resources, but it's one that I decided a few years ago was an appropriate investment for Washington State and our office. And so I think just early on, we took a different approach than most of the AGs.
Yeah. One of the areas of focus that your office has given attention to is one that Democrats in Congress, many Republicans in the U.S. Congress, and other attorneys generals in different states have also taken some attention or have provided some attention towards is that of market competition, antitrust activity, price fixing, monopoly pricing power. So give us a rundown from anesthesiologists to hospitals, about what your office has been up to and ultimately how you are thinking in terms of accountability for the healthcare system. How are you thinking about finding these and which battles to pick, so to speak?
Let's see. Well, I guess I'll try to take an initial stab at that. So, number one, just so the folks here are tracking. So, in our office, in the AG's office, we have a consumer protection division. We also have what's called an antitrust division. The antitrust division, to your question, obviously, DJ, makes sure that in all contexts, but including the healthcare context, that there is competition. There's not dominance with one entity. And that's good for consumers. That's why we have antitrust laws at the federal level and at the state level. When I became Attorney General, I think we only had 3 attorneys who did antitrust work in Washington State for all the areas that are out there when it comes to antitrust. And typically, unlike consumer protection, many state AGs, that wasn't unusual, have very small antitrust divisions. We've beefed that up dramatically. I think we've quadrupled the number of attorneys we have doing that work. And one reason why I chose to do that, to increase that presence we have, DJ, is in the area of healthcare. Because really the AG's office had not, just being candid, right? We had not historically been involved in reviewing potential mergers and acquisitions in the healthcare industry or any other industry for that matter. It was very small, our presence, and especially in the healthcare industry. So I think from my standpoint, I think to get to the second part of your question is, look, I'm not a healthcare expert, okay? Everybody on the Zoom meeting knows more about healthcare than I do, okay? And I'm not an antitrust expert, but my job is to make sure that there's a level playing field for consumers in our state. That's my job. And when it comes to antitrust work, that is critical. And so you referred to in passing a couple cases where we brought litigation, started investigation, brought investigations where in the healthcare industry, where entities were merging, purchasing, consolidating in a certain area. That could have been a Whatcom Skagit or over in Kitsap County. And as a result of that, those mergers and acquisitions had consolidated geographically, where consumers had limited options, and also the services were consolidated. So really, consumers had very few options for certain healthcare needs that they had. And that violates our state laws. So in one case, we really had to litigate for years. In the other, the entity really sort of cooperated more with our investigation. So we had sort of different outcomes there. But the outcome was the same in the sense of having to unwind some of those acquisitions and mergers so we can have a competitive marketplace when it comes to the healthcare industry in those areas and others across the state.
Karen Anderson asks about legislation related to hospital mergers and protecting reproductive health care. I don't know if you want to speak to that. Obviously, you advocate for legislation in your office. You also have to protect and represent the state of Washington. So you wear multiple hats, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on reproductive health care for women in Washington state legislation, but also what you make of this Texas bill and any implications it may have for Washington state donors, Washington state providers that might provide telehealth, or anybody in Washington state that might want to support women's reproductive healthcare choices in Texas. Thoughts?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So number one, I think what you referred to, you're right. For myself, our job is to defend and enforce Washington state law at the most basic level in terms of the work that our office does. And I personally obviously support reproductive rights and choice for women in our state. My personal views are less important than the law that we have in Washington state, which says the same thing, and we defend and enforce that. And so when we take that responsibility seriously. What's happening in Texas and the U.S. Supreme Court is, obviously extremely significant. But I can say that for Washington, typically, if there's a change in a state law outside of Washington state, I don't have legal authority to go intervene in a lawsuit over there. Okay, I don't have that authority any more than the Attorney General of Texas can come intervene in a state law issue we have here in Washington state. However, that said, and to get to this question a little bit, what we can do and what we do is if there are issues related to reproductive choice, voting rights, you pick the issue, right, that are big issues that people of our state, in my view, care a lot about. Washington state, I can file what's called an amicus brief. It's called a friend of the court brief, just a fancy term for a friend of the court brief. It's a brief that often other AGs work together on. We can file before a judge anywhere in the country, in any case, expressing the views of what Washingtonians might think. And what's going on in Texas, that's exactly the kind of situation when litigation will result from that. And that litigation will inevitably, I believe, end up at the U.S. Supreme Court. You can be sure that we'll be expressing our views about why it's important to have choice for women, why there are many challenges with Texas law, and why it violates Roe v. Wade, and why the U.S. Supreme Court should reverse it. So we'll no doubt be active in that inevitable litigation that ends up at the Court of Appeals and then on to the U.S. Supreme Court. Clearly, I was disappointed, to put it mildly, with the Supreme Court's decision is hardly the right word, but their unwillingness to take action on what I think, whatever one thinks about issues related to abortion, the Texas law just violates Roe v. Wade. There's just no getting around that. I don't think there are really sort of serious folks who necessarily disagree with that. The question is whether the U.S. Supreme Court will simply reverse Roe v. Wade. But right now, you've got one state, Texas, that does not have to follow Roe v. Wade. I think that's untenable constitutionally and from a policy perspective as well.
I do wonder, I know your office requested legislation a few years ago and the legislature adopted a provision in policy that would empower your office to protect Washington state residents from patent troll lawsuits. These, of course, are lawsuits from individuals or organizations who sue businesses or threaten to sue businesses because they're saying the way they do business actually was patented by them, and Washington folks can't do business that way. It sort of resonates with me. It seems sort of like an analog in that you could start seeing these lawsuits from Texas think tanks or nonprofit organizations threatening to sue Washington state residents because they have made a contribution to Planned Parenthood or an entity like that. So I'm curious to see what kind of paperwork gets generated out of all this. And are you, how would you manage or how would you watch that when it may be the case that vigilante attorneys just start filing legal threats to intimidate folks?
It's interesting. And I guess what I would say, if you're asking kind of how we think about that or how I make decisions around it, I think what I'd say is that folks who are on the Zoom, I guess I'd want you to know is if you read about something that's in the newspaper that's big, like what's going on in Texas, you can be sure that day I'm having a conversation with the leadership of my office about kind of the questions you're raising, DJ, including, hey, what's the future of that litigation? How can we be involved? Which AGs want to be involved? Who do we have in our office who has expertise in those issues, who could help write a brief? You get the idea. There's a lot of wheels go in motion immediately when something like that happens. And this would certainly be no different. What I can say emphatically is if anything related to Texas, if that had an adverse impact on so much as a single Washingtonian, A, I'd want to know about that. And then B, if it did, yes, we would want to take action to protect Washingtonians and their rights here in Washington state. So you're right, because Texas has this unusual provision that allows an individual, just a Texan, to literally litigate against the Uber driver who drives a woman to a clinic, for example, right? Literally, that is true. It's a very unusual provision, very unusual enforcement provision. And so if somehow that got connected to Washingtonians in some way, yes, that'd be something we'd want to know about. And maybe I should also add, DJ, which I should have mentioned at the beginning, is there's so many issues we're talking about. One thing I just want to mention to everybody who's watching, hey, if you ever have a situation where you think my office should know about something that's going on, let us know. Reach out to my antitrust team, my consumer protection team, call our office, or if you've got questions about how your entity is handling something, my team is available. In general, we're happy to chat. Sometimes we have limitations based on who our clients are and that type of thing. But in general, my team can be very helpful in helping you sort through issues you may have. Or if you've got complaints about something in the industry, feel free to communicate that to my team.
Carol Moser asks a question about the Attorney General's role vis-a-vis mask enforcement, particularly of elected officials in some more rural counties that may decide not to follow state mandates or directives. Where does your office fit in terms of enforcement of state directives like mask mandates?
Great question. I figured we might get to that today with what's going on. So our role, just to kind of frame that up first, our role in the AG's office is, as I mentioned earlier, we defend and enforce state law. People often think of that through the initiative process, if the people pass initiative, or the legislature taking action. But obviously that also includes any emergency proclamations by the governor. That's essentially a state law, and we defend it. So, DJ, what I would say is that for the governor's emergency proclamations regarding the pandemic, there have been literally dozens of lawsuits challenging, I think, all of those, right? Federal courts, state courts, small jurisdictions, big jurisdictions, Eastern Washington, Western Washington, you name the jurisdiction, we've been sued in those jurisdictions. So our job is to defend those. That literally is our job. So far, and some of those have been filed by just individuals. Some have been filed by very sophisticated national law firms, you name it. But we have prevailed in every one of those lawsuits so far. So in Washington state, the governor's emergency powers have been upheld by judges all across our state. That is different than some other states where the governor's emergency powers, say in Michigan, for example, or Virginia, are not as broad as in Washington. And in those states, the AG was unsuccessful in defending the governor's emergency powers. But here, the governor's emergency powers have been upheld in courts, and that litigation is ongoing. So when it comes to mask mandates, for example, I think the question maybe went to, hey, specific elected officials, if I was hearing you correctly, DJ, who might be in local jurisdictions who are not following those laws. Look, it's not like the AG's office can go and file some lawsuit against a local elected official. Elections have consequences, I would say. constituents in jurisdictions have certain powers with their local elected officials. I'm definitely aware of, I guess one thing I would say is that, maybe this is going a little broader in the question, DJ, but so I apologize a bit, but
No, it's fine.
I have been concerned a bit, whether it's this type of issue or local elected officials, sheriffs, for example, not being willing to follow laws put in place by the people through the initiative process on what I would consider common sense gun control laws, where I think some sheriffs view it as a badge of honor to say, I'm not going to enforce that law. By the way, approved by the people, right through the initiative process. To me, that's outrageous. That's not the role of a local elected official. We're a system of, as you said at the beginning, right? We have a system in place. And look, there are plenty of state laws I personally disagree with. We could go on and on about those, but my job is to defend those if someone challenges them. It doesn't matter what I think about the law. My job is to defend it. And I do that no matter what I think about those laws all the time. There are initiatives that people pass that I voted against, but we defend that to the best of our ability. That's our job. And it's unfortunate when local elected officials don't do that, because that's where things break down. Again, going back to your beginning, right? That's where that center breaks down. And so, but it's not as if the state AG, to get to the question more directly, my apologies for
Okay.
for going sideways. It's not like I can come in and do something about that, but there are constituents they have certain powers with local elected officials. And I encourage the person who asked that question to perhaps think about those. I have in some context, by the way, written to elected officials. There are sometimes repercussions. There can be liability to local jurisdictions if they're not following state laws. And guess where that liability falls to? The taxpayers of that jurisdiction, if there's litigation. So those are the kinds of issues that are of great concern to me as the leading law enforcement official of the state of Washington. But having local elected officials not following state law is discouraging. But it's a trend. We're seeing more and more of it.
You've been a private practicing attorney, a chess champion.
Long time ago.
King County Council member. Now, as you mentioned, in your ninth year as Attorney General. At the end of your term, have you given any thought to what you might want to do next?
No, I mean, I get that question a lot, and what I would say is that, if you're interested in the law and you're interested in politics and you're interested in public policy, like things we're talking about, DJ, if you're interested in those things, in my view, there is no better job than being the Attorney General of the state of Washington. I'm fourth generation Washingtonian. This is my home. I love it here. And I just find the job to be endlessly fascinating and rewarding, and leading a team that's really committed to public service. So, one thing I'll add is that so much in politics, and I think you kind of mentioned this again at your beginning, is it's hard to get traction. It's hard to find progress. Look at DC, for God's sakes, right? I mean, God bless anyone willing to serve back there, but it can be discouraging as a citizen to see just the deadlock on huge issues. As an Attorney General, you have a lot of freedom, right? Respect the state legislature, but I don't need to go get votes of the state legislature if I want to take on Purdue Pharmaceutical and the Sackler thing. I can just go do that. That's a decision I can make. And that's the case across the board in numerous areas. And I find that extremely rewarding, where, courtroom, I find, is the great equalizer. If you have an advocate who's capable, and our office is full of advocates who are very capable, that's a level playing field. You can take on the most powerful corporation, you can take on a president, you can take on anyone. And if you're in a courtroom, you can get a fair shake. And if your cause is right and the law's on your side, you're going to win. And you can stop an injustice in its tracks. And I find that so rewarding, and it's just a unique position to have, and one that I love. So no, I don't think much beyond just getting through the day with young twins and my job.
Yeah. I know we're running a little short on time here, but I want to ask you this question for folks who don't know much about you, or they know just a little bit about what they see in the headlines. Now that you've had such a long career in public service, what is a Bob Ferguson Democrat?
Oh man, I don't know if I've ever had that question. First, I'm not sure there's such a thing as but I guess the way I view sort of politics or my politics is, I guess a couple things. Number one, obviously I consider myself a Democrat, a progressive. Choose what term you want, but I like to think of myself as being practical. I'm interested in solutions. I'm not just interested in the job to say I'm the Attorney General and to make my older brothers call me General Ferguson at the Thanksgiving Day table, right? That's nice side benefit, but that's not what motivates me to get from the morning. Well, what I love about being in politics is being able to achieve things and to get things done. And that I find extremely rewarding. And so I like being around people in politics who want to achieve something, who have a goal, who are driving towards a goal, but they're practical about that, right? So whatever their political persuasion might be. I guess the other thing I would say is that I am very focused as a politician on people-focused politics. Whether you want to call that grassroots, populism, different terms I see about that. But, for me, in the work that I do, I guess what I would say is that I'm very focused on the impacts of policies and the law on everybody in our state, especially those who don't have resources, who are simply struggling to get by, who got busy lives, and that is something I find that I try to focus my work around. And look, the way I look at it is, I was in a private law firm for 5 years, like you alluded to. I walked out the door of that private law firm, DJ. I knew they had a stack of hundreds and hundreds of resumes of better lawyers than me who could take my spot, right? But one thing I love about public service is for thousands and thousands and thousands of Washingtonians, they need an advocate, right? They can't afford an attorney to take on Comcast if Comcast is screwing them over on their bill, right? If a healthcare provider is not providing charity care like they're required to under state law, who can do that? They're just trying to get by with their jobs in a pandemic. But to be able to do that kind of work with a great team, I find very rewarding. So sort of a practical approach that's people focused is something that at least I think about in the way I approach my work.
Attorney General, former chess champion, father of twins, Bob Ferguson, thank you very much, sir, for making time. I appreciate it.
DJ, great seeing you. Hope everybody has a great day. Thanks again.